John Fowke is the most interesting man in English Civil War London. Not the richest or the most powerful or the most radical, but the most interesting, because everyone in London who was an enemy of King Charles was a friend or partner of John Fowke. His conflict with the king spilled over into conflict with the East India Company, and he won both of these wars. In fact, over 35 years, John Fowke was instrumental to every upheaval, coup, dissolution of Parliament, and change of state in London. He and his partners set state policies for trade and maritime affairs under the Cromwellian Protectorate, and in the end, they helped make way for the Restoration. John Fowke was not from the old guard of London. He was an outsider, born in Gloucestershire, so he had a chip on his shoulder, and that likely fed his ambitions. There are many contemporary sources referring to Fowke. Royalist sources call him one of the most seditious of the whole pack, agitating London against the king. They point out his associations with all the king's enemies in the city, such as fire-breathing chaplain Hugh Peters. And they say Fowke is leading the charge to get rid of Charles and even monarchy altogether. Charles called Fowke a traitor. Their relationship had started out badly 15 years before, and it got worse because of a lawsuit. The East India Company sued John Fowke in the Chancery Court of London. While historians have pointed to this case, it was unexplored in the historiography, which is how I became interested as a military historian. Saltpeter is the main ingredient in gunpowder. There are no natural nitrate deposits in the British Isles. Nitrates can be obtained from manure waste, but the processing can take up to a year, and the product is often contaminated with calcium. In India, however, nitrates form a crust on the surface of the Gangetic Plain after the monsoon rains. It was very pure and cheap to process. East Indiamen returned to England with their holds full of the stuff as ballast. This was the moment when the Atlantic economy was exploding, and John Fowke's faction of merchants was determined to dominate it. Gunpowder was essential to this project. In his book, Merchants and Revolution, Robert Brenner shows how that same group of merchants formed the nucleus of revolution in London. More recently, L.H. Roper shows how this same faction shaped English trade policy into the Restoration. John Fowke and his neighbor, Maurice Thompson, were architects of what became the British Empire. In the term of art among historians, they created the British Gunpowder Empire. In 2021, Jordan Downs showed how that same faction of merchants used the issue of the Irish Rebellion to break London from King Charles. The London business community had large fortunes invested in Ireland, and they did not trust Charles to put that rebellion down. Not only was the king suspiciously popish, all of his military adventures to date had been complete disasters. He was simply the wrong man to lead an army for London. So London built their own army for Ireland. Charles started building his own army, and then Parliament turned their new army on the king. While Downes is focused on Isaac Pennington, the Lord Mayor of London in 1642 and 1643, it was Pennington's political partner, John Fowke, who led the coup in the city to make Pennington Lord Mayor. Pennington was a Coleman Street religious radical. Even if Fowke was not noted for public piety, he clearly had good relations with the militant Puritans and chaplains of the city. For that matter, Fowke married a son, John Fowke Jr., to the daughter of a sergeant major in the London militia in 1638, at the very moment when the trained bands were radicalizing. Fowke served on the militia committee until the end of his life and shaped the London war machine profoundly. He agitated for the new model army to be raised, he helped finance it, and he lobbied for Cromwell to be put in charge of the cavalry. After the war, the faction of merchants associated with Fowke were known as the New Modelers. Fowke began his career of upheavals almost as soon as Charles was king. Importer merchants like Fowke were upset when the customs house raised impost rates without the permission of Parliament. It was the beginning of popular tax resistance against Charles. Parliamentary hearings found that the merchants were correct, that the king had in fact ignored Parliament's traditional right to set the impost rates. But Charles could not rise to the occasion when he was offered a compromise, and so Parliament dissolved and the 11-year personal rule began. During this controversy, Parliament ordered William Acton, a sheriff of London, to release Fowke and his fellow merchants, who were jailed at the Fleet, a famous prison in London. Acton refused to recognize the order. Charles rewarded Acton with a baronetcy, a plum that was never awarded to a London alderman who had not yet served as mayor. Charles had broken with tradition once more, this time just to punish John Fowke. Which brings us to the lawsuit. Fowke had to pay his way out of this trouble, and it was very expensive. 1 year later, Sir William Acton was suing John Fowke on behalf of the East India Company as company counsel. The company alleged that Fowke had agreed to ensure a cargo of saltpeter from the Ganges Plain of India purchased by Daniel Bonnell. Bonnell skipped out on the bill, and Fowke was held liable. I have examined the documents from the Chancery Court case, and they are in remarkable condition. While there are some missing or illegible words at the margins, they are intact enough to make out the meaning. In the bills of complaint, for example, the company mentions their missing saltpeter dozens of times. We don't know where it is. It could be anywhere. Are the stores of the kingdom safe? And so on. If that seems a bit histrionic, there is a reason for this. Saltpeter and gunpowder were what we might call controlled substances today. As Brenda J. Buchanan discovered in her research on the Stuart state and gunpowder, at the very same time this court case was unfolding, the royal court was cracking down on illicit trade in saltpeter and gunpowder. The smoking gun that links John Fowke to the gunpowder trade is in the company's own meeting minutes from 1636. The East India Company wanted to make their own gunpowder, but the king's officials were all standing in the way and holding out for their own piece of the action. After John Fowke got involved, the administrative logjam cleared, and the company began making gunpowder. In the second year of the litigation, John Fowke's brother-in-law intervened as counsel. While this legal gambit failed, the documents point to emerging factionalism in the London merchant community over Dutch ties. Daniel Bonnell had been on the lam for 4 years, but after he was caught, company records show that he was represented by the same lawyer as William Courtine. Charles himself was a friend of the Courtines, complicating the situation. That same year, Fowke fitted out the flagship for a Courtine interloping expedition that tread on the East India Company's monopoly over English traffic in the Indian Ocean. Fowke got his political revenge on Sir Acton first. Acton was supposed to be made Lord Mayor in 1640, but a crowd of young workers showed up at the guild hall to prevent him from making the list. This was the birth of mass politics, and Fowke was an early political organizer. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 was a product of Fowke's community organization. Typically, a pamphlet would appear during the week. On Sunday, sermons around London would reflect the contents of the pamphlet. By midweek, Fowke would lead a crowd of citizens presenting a petition based on the pamphlet to Parliament. This was the formula for the trial of Strafford, the Root and Branch petition, and many more examples. Fowke's pet issues, saltpeter, gunpowder, and the Irish settlement, all figure prominently in the Grand Remonstrance to Charles, which was printed by demand of a large crowd of Londoners, led by John Fowke. On the fateful day, January 4th, 1642, when Charles came into the House of Commons expecting to arrest 5 MPs for treason, he found them missing. In fact, they were hiding out at Isaac Pennington's house. Waiting for Charles instead was John Fowke. According to Samuel Butler, Fowke had a saucy and insolent speech expressing his hope that the missing men would be tried, but in a parliamentary way. It was a pointed personal sting. Charles turned on his elevated heel and walked out. He did not return until his trial. It was the definitive split with London. John Fowke was right there, and he built the armies that fought the king, but he never appears in this scene when it is painted or portrayed on film or written into dramatic retellings. Why? That question mark gets bigger when you consider his post-war career. John Fowke used the new model army to restore his position on the militia committee. He pressed the Rump Parliament so hard to reverse the Chancery Court verdict that it dissolved. He got what he wanted from the Oliver Cromwell dictatorship long after the regicide. My thesis project, in fact, proposes that John Fowke has been understudied as an agent in the febrile atmosphere of pre-war London, and that the fuse of war had been lit many years before in contentious litigation related to the supply of gunpowder in the kingdom. But a thesis is not big enough to contain all the information I have collected about John Fowke. There is already enough for a book. Further research will surely uncover more about his role in the political and military revolutions that took place in London. To subscribe for updates, visit polemology.net.